As the Coast Guard aircraft emerges from a thick cloud bank, an unbelievable sight unfolds below. The ocean is ablaze with lights, so many and so vast that they seem to mirror the stars above. But these aren't stars. Stretching across the horizon is the world's largest illegal floating city, an unstoppable fleet of thousands of fishing vessels, flanked by colossal factory ships. It's a relentless force, stripping the oceans bare as it moves from one depleted fishing ground to the next. And China, the nation behind it all, remains unapologetic about the devastation left in the fleet's wake. How did this floating empire come to exist? Why does it continue unchecked? And what does it mean for the future of the world's oceans? These are the questions we'll explore on today's episode of the Infographic Show, the dark side of China's illegal floating cities. They're known as distant water fishing fleets, and many nations operate them, but no country comes close to the scale and aggression of China's fleet. As a voracious consumer of seafood, China isn't just trying to feed its own population of over 1 billion. It's trying to supply the entire Asian market as the nation strives to be the dominant seafood player in the world. The scale is absolutely astounding. Fleets of thousands of ships moving like swarms across the globe, depleting fishing grounds in their wake. These floating cities don't just stick to international waters. They often end up in fisheries of smaller nations that are too weak to resist or too economically reliant on China to push back. The main victims are in Southeast Asia, where Chinese fishing fleets run rampant, often backed up by Chinese Coast Guard ships, equipped with large bore cannons and sometimes even anti-ship missiles. Here, China also uses its massive unrecognized maritime militia force, thousands of fishing vessels and fishermen equipped with everything from water cannons to assault rifles. Knowing they have the backing of the Chinese military, this gray zone militia is even bold enough to impede passage of U.S. warships, creating safety hazards and forcing American ships to reroute around them. For the locals who don't have the protection of a strong navy, their appearance means that you'd better get out while you still can, as they will not hesitate to use force to remove you. The destruction of Southeast Asian fisheries means that Chinese fleets must go further and further from home to find their catch. Today, these fleets roam everywhere from Africa to Latin America, only staying away from the economic exclusion zones of nations strong enough to resist them. Recently, a massive fleet of Chinese vessels appeared off the coast of Argentina, looking to cash in on the squid season that local fishermen have exploited for centuries. Those fishing fleets are one of the greatest drivers of fish stock collapse on the planet. Not only do they fish in waters not legally theirs to exploit, but they also target protected waters. In 2020, a fleet of 300 fishing vessels were discovered to be fishing for sharks and squid in protected waters near the Galapagos Islands, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Ecuadorian authorities raised the alarm on the international stage, fearing that the continued exploitation will lead to the total collapse of the Galapagos maritime ecosystem. In 2019 and 2020, Indonesian authorities seized several Chinese vessels operating in protected waters, targeting endangered species. In 2019, a Chinese trawler was discovered to be using illegal and highly destructive bottom trawling methods that wreak havoc on maritime ecosystems. These bottom trawling methods involve lowering a net onto the seafloor and weighing it down at the open end. The ship simply moves along an area of the ocean, dragging the net behind it. The nets stretch for hundreds of feet wide, decimating fish and invertebrate populations. But the act of trawling physically destroys subsurface ecosystems, ripping coral apart and turning the bottom of the ocean into a wasteland that can no longer support colonization by marine life. In 2022 and 2023, Chinese fishing vessels were discovered to be operating under local licenses to avoid scrutiny. However, they flagrantly violated catch quotas, leading to overcatch and fish stock collapse. They were also discovered to be specifically targeting valuable but protected species that are illegal to commercially catch. Sometimes, though, they mess with the country that can actually fight back. Argentina has frequently discovered Chinese fishing fleets operating illegally in its waters and deployed Navy ships to chase them away. In 2016, the Argentinians had had enough, and after a Chinese vessel attempted to evade capture, it was attacked and sunk by an Argentinian Navy vessel. The sheer size of the Chinese fishing fleets can be devastating to the local environment, but they also lead to poverty in nations too weak to fight them off. Local fishermen already struggling to make a living are bullied off of their own waters. When the Chinese fleets do move on, they leave behind more than just empty seas. Communities are left with no income, no resources, and no way to fight back. The Chinese appetite for shark fin soup, a huge status symbol in China and a cultural delicacy, is especially devastating. After overfishing for sharks in their own waters, Chinese fleets set out to target sharks in international waters and other nations' economic zones. The sharks are hauled on board and their fins are sliced off while still alive, and then they're simply tossed overboard. Without their fins, the sharks drown as they slowly drift to the bottom of the ocean. The Chinese make no other use of the shark, wasting the entire animal simply to secure the precious fins. The biggest problem with the Chinese fishing fleets isn't just their massive size, it's the fishing practices they employ, with complete disregard for local regulations meant to ensure sustainable and responsible fishing practices. Chinese ships will often employ the most effective methods, such as the aforementioned bottom trawling. The damage to the coral reefs and the seabeds from bottom trawling is so severe that even years after being banned in some regions, marine ecosystems have yet to recover. In Peru, the impact from Chinese fleets is so bad that local fishermen have reported a 70% drop in catch of species like jumbo squid. This is mirrored by their overfishing of North Korean waters, where they have decimated the local squid population. As if all of these abuses weren't enough, Chinese fishing fleets often employ slave labor as well. A report by the Environmental Justice Foundation found evidence of 12 Chinese fishing vessels using North Korean forced labor. This not only violates international human rights standards, but also breaches sanctions imposed on North Korea. In order to avoid detection, the North Korean crews were transferred between boats frequently and kept at sea for up to a decade at a time. Their wages meanwhile went straight to the North Korean state, who used it to finance the Kim regime and its pursuit of weapons of mass destruction. According to the North Koreans themselves, they faced 3 equally bad choices: be conscripted into the military, work on plantations under the supervision of the government, or work on Chinese fishing vessels. One who had worked on a boat for 7 years said that he had never seen a single wage, and neither had his family. Instead, once his contract was up, the government would build him and his family a home. Hardly a fair compensation for almost a decade spent at sea. This report tracks with discoveries by the international community of the export of tens of thousands of North Korean laborers to Chinese factories and seafood processing plants. And it's quite possible for fishermen to remain at sea for years due to the massive size of these fleets, often known as floating cities. In order to do so, the fleets employ a level of logistical support that rivals the famous global logistics of the US military. First, in order to keep them operational, many vessels receive direct fuel subsidies from the government, with massive tanker ships refueling them at sea. This ensures they can remain operational for months, even years, without returning to port. In some cases, the Chinese government even covers the cost of building new fishing vessels, giving its fleets a massive advantage over international competitors. Giant supply ships also accompany the fuel tankers to meet up with the fleets out at sea. These supply ships carry all the essentials the fishermen need, from nets to fish hooks, maintenance equipment, and even creature comforts for the crews in forms of snacks or electronic goods. In order for fishing boats to remain productive, each fleet is accompanied by several factory ships. With several factory ships in tow, Chinese vessels can drop off their catch so it can be processed on board, with fish and squid being canned or frozen and stored in refrigerated tanks. The packaged seafood is fully ready to hit supermarkets and loaded onto refrigerated vessels, which then head back to port to unload the catch. The parts that can't be used to sell in supermarkets, bones and fish guts, are turned into fish meal. Transfer and factory vessels will also often have live holding tanks, keeping catch alive for the trip back to shore so it can be sold fresh on the market, commanding a much higher price. Eventually, every crew needs a little R&R, at least the Chinese non-slave crews do. Rather than returning home to port, crew transfer ships bring fishermen out to the fleet at sea, allowing the vessels to continue non-stop as crews are swapped out. To keep morale up, support ships provide meal replenishments, and some large vessels will also have huge mess halls and kitchens that can feed hundreds of sailors at once. To deal with illnesses and injuries, the fleets will often have a ship with a small hospital and medical staff on board. Reportedly, conditions are not great, but good enough to keep fishermen on the job for everything but the most serious injuries. When it does come time to handle serious injuries, fishing vessels will often send out distress calls to local coast guards, hypocritically asking for aid from the nation whose waters they are often illegally exploiting. When it comes to at-sea rest and relaxation, fishermen can't expect much. They typically live in dormitory-style bunks with only a limited amount of room allotted to each person. Only the larger ships have common rooms with TVs and even laptops and satellite internet. For fishermen on smaller vessels, though, they must entertain themselves much as sailors have done for centuries on end now. One of the areas targeted by Chinese fishing fleets for exploitation is the Atlantic Blue Hole, an area roughly 2,500 square miles in size. It's located 200 miles off the coast of Argentina. Here, the seafloor abruptly increases in depth to around 2,600 feet as the continental shelf ends. The mixing of warm and cold currents make it an ideal condition for marine life to thrive, and this is why it's so appealing to Chinese fishing fleets. Nations in the area follow strict regulations on fishing activities in order to prevent the collapse of fish stocks. But Chinese fleets here flagrantly violate those regulations with impunity. They especially target squid, short-fin squid here, and on the Pacific side of South America, Humboldt squid. For years, Chinese fleets have alternated between both coasts of the continent, as the short-fin squid season is in summer and the Humboldt squid season is in winter, spending entire months fishing with zero regard for sustainability. That is a big problem, but especially for the Atlantic short-fin squid, as they have lifespans that only last a year. With Chinese fleets catching hundreds of tons of squid, it doesn't give them enough time to get through their reproductive cycle. This leads to smaller and smaller catches each year, and the deployment of more desperate and destructive fishing tactics to try to meet quotas. In both their hunt for shortfin and Humboldt squid, what Chinese fleets are doing is in no way illegal. The fishing grounds most commonly exploited are in international waters, where there is no jurisdiction by either Chile or Argentina. However, Chinese vessels completely disregard regional fishing regulations and standards meant to ensure sustainability of squid and fish populations. This inevitably leads to the same collapse that they've already unleashed on their own coasts. To make matters worse, Chinese fleets will often hurry to process their catch, thus disguising its origin and even species. This allows them to offload the catch without triggering various international alarms. It's done with the implicit cooperation of the Chinese government, who finances and directly supports these massive fishing fleets, a form of modern maritime colonialism. International law states that any fishing vessel over 300 tons must transmit a tracking signal at all times. To skirt economic exclusion zones or even protected waters, Chinese vessels will often simply turn off their transmitters, essentially disappearing from view. Without the resources of a national coast guard or navy, countries can struggle to track Chinese ships and ensure they're staying out of their exclusive economic zone or nearby marine reserves. The impact that the fleets have go far beyond just the pillaging of the ocean, though. In the last 50 years, global maritime life has dropped in numbers by half due to overfishing, with dire repercussions for human life given how many people rely on fish as a primary food source. But the less tangible effect is the environmental toll that massive Chinese fishing fleets have just through their operations alone. Chinese ships are a rich source of pollution for local waters. Often, Chinese ships can be older and not constructed up to the same codes that make other nation ships more expensive and more resilient. This leads to fuel and machine oil leaks, which can add up across a fishing fleet of hundreds or thousands of ships. The debris from fishing activities also causes significant environmental harm. Fish will often swallow the nylon used in fishing lines or nets, choking to death on it or filling their stomach and starving to death. Other fish can then eat the affected fish, poisoning themselves. And even more disturbingly, fish rich in microplastics end up on dinner plates around the world, feeding off of various plastic wastes caused by the fishing fleets. Then there's the crews themselves. The sheer amount of human excrement and urine from massive fleets can lead to poisoning of the water, taking days to clear up after a fleet is left. With fishing fleets often targeting the same waters over and over again, the effect can add up. This too ends up in fish that end up being consumed by humans, and Chinese crews leave behind other forms of waste as well. After the passage of a Chinese fleet off the shore of Ecuador, locals found their beaches inundated with plastic waste. Everything from plastic bags to water bottles, all with Chinese labels, land on beaches and have an impact on tourism that some countries rely on. It's thought that 30% of the garbage collected in the Galapagos Island shores comes from Chinese fleets. Huge cleanup efforts often have to be organized in the wake of a large fishing fleet, with the Chinese government refusing any culpability or responsibility to assist in the cleanup efforts. Off the coast of West Africa, locals have tracked Chinese vessels registered through shell companies and locally flagged. This allows them to skirt regulations that prohibit international vessels from exploiting local resources. Fishermen, too, have gotten into violent confrontations with Chinese ships out at sea and engaged in sabotage of fishing lines and nets in order to deter the vessels from continuing operation. All too often, though, the Chinese ships are simply far too large for the small local vessels and artisan fishers to compete with, and they come in enough numbers to deter more aggressive means of getting rid of them. As a way of trying to end the scourge of Chinese fishing fleets, organizations around the world have tried to document not just their environmental crimes, but those against the crews of the boats themselves. Chinese fleets rely heavily on Indonesian, North Korean, and Vietnamese workers, but when operating in Africa, they'll bring on local workers. These workers report brutal working conditions, with their Chinese captains and crews forcing them to work as much as 24-hour-long shifts with few breaks. Physical abuse is so prevalent that in one France 24 investigation, they discovered that every single African worker hired to work on a Chinese vessel reported physical abuse from the Chinese crew. Work conditions are also extremely unsafe, with little regard given for worker safety. Non-Chinese crew members will be brought on with no training on the safety equipment aboard the ship, if any exists in the first place. Fishermen will operate without life jackets even during extreme weather, thus it's not uncommon for fatalities and men being lost overboard. There is some hope on the horizon though, as international pressure has mounted to the point that even the Chinese government is starting to take some action. The government has ended subsidies for specific vessels discovered to be operating illegally and created an internal blacklist of vessels who frequently engage in illegal fishing. However, while fishery crimes are prosecuted as normal crimes in the rest of the world, China still considers it more of an administrative crime, and thus violations rarely come with any real consequences. Despite this, China has made public commitments to increase the responsibility of its fishing industry and to adopt more sustainable practices. This has been met with a great deal of skepticism, as the Chinese government's credibility on matters like this is extremely lacking. However, the very real fact is that China relies heavily on fishing to feed itself, and it's the world's largest exporter of fish. As global fish stocks collapse due to overfishing, China must adopt sustainable practices or see its largest industry fail and its people suffer a massive food crisis. For now, though, there's little indication that the Chinese fishing fleets are set to stop their destructive and exploitative practices anytime soon. From destroying fragile maritime ecosystems to collapsing global fish stocks and even exploiting forced labor, China's illegal floating cities are wreaking havoc across the world's oceans, made up of hundreds of ships operating like a giant predatory organism, consuming everything in their path, with little regard for the consequences. How should the world respond? Should nations take a stand, or is China simply too powerful to stop? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Did you know puppy yoga encourages irresponsible breeding and leads to puppies who will age out and be put to death in shelters? Now that you do, go check out normal things that are illegal in North Korea, or click on this other video instead.